So everyone, welcome to our week eight session of 7 weeks. So we're on week eight here. Quick session wrap up is what we're calling today. So first thing, if you need to, as always, check the bill tracker to see where things ended up. If I can get, there we go. If I can get the slides to advance, you can scan this QR code. You can go check out the bill tracker. Obviously, we're not changing any positions today like we would at an LPC. But if you want to go see where everything landed, you can go check out that bill tracker. We do have multiple spring trainings coming up, and I want to make sure you know about those as we get going. So, of course, today, March 13th, we're doing our quick recap. Next week, March 19th, we'll have training. On the 26th is when we will do the land use training with APA. That will be at the Trust and on Zoom. And then on April 9th, we'll have one more spring training. Some of the questions you may ask today are going to help us to inform what those trainings look like in the future, as we're still working everything out. Not quite a week away from the session yet. So what is today's objective? What are we going to do today? Today, we're going to do a quick status update on all of the bills discussed at LPC or in nightly emails. Or stated differently, we're going to do 64 bills in under 60 minutes. So buckle up. This is going to go very quickly. We are not going to go into depth on most of the bills here. What we really want to do is tell you, we had talked about this at one point during the LPC during the session. And then the last week of session happened, and this is our chance to get you caught up and let you know what happened to the bills. Did they pass? Did they fail? Were they amended? So again, we're not going to go super in depth in a lot of these bills, but really give you that quick status update of what happened since we maybe brought it up to you a couple of months ago at the start of session, or since our last LPC a week and a half ago. So that's where we're headed today. I just want to give you some quick overall numbers. So one, there were 582 bills that passed in the 2025 general legislative session. That is not quite a record. The record was set last year at 591, but 582 does come in at second place, beating 575, which was a record a couple of years ago. There were 962 total bills drafted, which is a record. So you can see 568 House bills, 342 Senate bills, and 52 resolutions. So more bills drafted than ever before. For the league, we tracked 279 bills. I don't know if that's a record, but it's a record since I've been here in the last few years. We had 34 bills that we supported, 26 that we opposed, 56 we were neutral on, and our new position that we had this year, which was monitor, it came in clutch with 161 bills that we monitored, meaning we need to be aware of them. We'll take a good look at them now that we're through session, but they weren't bills that we were engaging on necessarily in a big way, or we may have negotiated on a bill to get it to a monitor spot. Then we took no position on one bill, and then one bill, yes, is still position pending because it sort of petered out there at the end, and that's what we're going to talk about. Right out of the gate is turn over to Molly to talk about our position pending bill and what happened with 337.
Absolutely. Thanks, Justin. And sorry, folks, Zoom decided to keep crashing on my computer, so doing this from my phone. But 337 Land Use Development Amendments by Kurt Cullimore. This was kind of the bill for the development districts to own all development districts. It created the Beehive Development Agency, created significant community impact projects, or SCIPs. And most concerning for us was that these SCIPs did not require local government consent. This is the bill that inspired our first ever Emergency Thursday LPC, as well as probably one of our longest discussions in LPC on Monday about how we approach this bill. There was a first sub that came out that we did grant local consent, still had some issues. We were expecting a second sub with some more concessions to make things more favorable for municipalities. But at the end of the day, this bill kind of ended up, I would say, dying under its own weight. It died a procedural death in the Senate. It did not pass out of that chamber in time to be considered. But we do expect this concept to come back, and we anticipate that kind of these development areas will be a conversation that we will need to have in the interim for these big statewide impact projects. Next, the other big one that we looked at was Senate Bill 333, which is the Major Sporting Event Venue Financing District Amendments. This is better. We liked this more because it is locally driven. So cities or counties that have qualifying venues in them could create these sporting districts. They have enhanced tax authority. And in the original version of the bill, it was quite expansive. There was a focus on the Olympics, but it also really could have been any professional sports or international sports venue. Through our negotiations, it got a little bit more narrow. So it is locally driven. It is only for Olympic venues. So the PGA venues and some of the other provisions were removed. And it does have enhanced tax authority, but we were able to negotiate some limitations within there. Specifically, counties do not have that municipal franchise tax authority for energy or telecom anymore. And then the taxing authority it gave to Summit County can only be imposed on unincorporated areas of the county. With that, I'll pass it on for housing and land use.
All right, Jared, it's all you.
Thank you, Molly. Perfect. So the first one here that we're going to discuss is HB 550. This is the building permit fee prohibition amendments. This was Representative Peterson, and what this does is where it started was it prohibited all municipalities from charging or collecting on any other governmental entities that had a project coming through your city. It came up relatively late within the session, and as far as a priority goes, and where it ended up, we were able to limit the inspection fee to the water conservancy districts and have an automatic termination of July 1, 2026, so that we could come back in interim and address some of the issues that the water conservancy districts were having. So we'll come back in the interim on that. That we opposed. We were able to limit it, but it ultimately passed. Okay, so the next one, this one is municipal and corporation modifications, HB 540. This one was an attempt to stop the ability of preliminary municipalities from being created. And since feasibility studies are required to create a preliminary municipality, what it tried to do is say that you can't proceed doing a feasibility study after February 2025 until April 2026. So it tried to have a freeze time period on it. It ultimately died in the Senate and didn't come up for a vote before midnight. The next one is SB 340. This came up very late in the session, protected person amendments. There's a lot here on this slide, and actually the next slide as well. I won't go through all of this, but essentially what this does, it allows a protected person, which is someone who received a credible threat of harm or death and currently is at risk of serious bodily harm or death by that person or an affiliate of that person. So they are allowed to go to the Department of Public Safety and receive a certificate saying that they are a legitimate, why don't you go back, Justin, a legitimate public protected person, and they are able to build certified improvements, essentially providing protection around or even underneath their property. The current bill said that it was not subject to county or municipal land use regulations, and also provided that if a city unlawfully conditioned, delayed, or denied building permit, that there would be penalties under the law. Next slide, Justin. What we were able to do here is we were able to reduce the credible threat down to the prior 4 years instead of 5. And we would also, and also the ability to build that certified improvement within, instead of 3 years down to 2 years. We were able to remove the penalties from being considered, and also we're able to make an exception to the county and municipal land use regulations to 500 feet. You wouldn't be able to see the security from 500 feet from the protected property. Again, this was late in the session, and as I think Justin might indicate, we didn't have a whole lot of political capital and at this point in the session, and so we opposed this, but it ultimately passed, but we were able to get it to a better spot than when it started. The next one is I'm going to pass off.
Yep, Carson's going to take over for a few slides here, Jared.
Yep, thanks, Jared. And this is the annual omnibus alcohol bill. There's one of these every year that mostly contains technical changes. The reason this is in the land use section was for a brief period of time there was a land use component to this bill. The bill started with a 36-acre overlay for an alcohol district at the point of the mountain development, trying to tackle a specific proximity conflict between a park and some new retail development. And then an early sub came out, which allowed local governments to waive the minimum licensing proximity requirement for public parks and playgrounds, which would have been really helpful from an economic development standpoint. We spoke in support of that provision a couple different times, and this conversation has been had at LPC, and thank you all for providing us with examples of where this has been an impediment, because we were able to use those to help push for this. The bill sponsor, Senator Stevenson, resisted, I think, 4 attempts in committee and on the floor to remove that provision, and then it became dramatic when the bill actually failed in the Senate, which I've never seen the big annual alcohol bill fail before. And it was later revived without that provision, but it was pretty interesting for a moment there. So long story short, that will have to be a continuing point of discussion. The Senate just didn't feel comfortable making broad proximity changes this year. All right, and then HB 320, this is municipal ordinance amendments. Essentially, this bill would have allowed local governments to impose a steeper civil or criminal penalty for repeated code enforcement violators, specifically for residential violations, parking, and short-term rentals. This bill had gone through several different changes to try to rein in some of the penalties. At first, the House felt like it was a little bit too steep, and then eventually the bill went to the Senate Rev and Tax Committee. Anytime you have one of the small Senate committees at the end of the session, it's kind of just luck of the draw at that point, and there just happened to be only a handful of senators on, and ultimately the bill did not pass forward. So unfortunate to see, but that's where it ended. Senate Bill 280, this was actually a pretty straightforward bill. Some of you remember House Bill 151 from a couple years ago, which restricted how local governments can use retail incentives. This bill predominantly is technical cleanup, trying to reorganize that section of code a little bit so it's a little easier to read. If you remember the flow chart that we've provided in past years, you'll be grateful for that. The biggest policy changes are, first, that it allows housing to not just be on site, but to be within a quarter mile of the retail facility, which I think will be really helpful for some communities to do mixed use development and have kind of a retail center there. And then the other change is the GOEO report now aligns with the municipal fiscal year, so you don't have to submit the report before the fiscal year ends. And there's a provision requiring GOEO to respond to local governments if they submit a retail incentive report. So this was a positive bill, not a lot of substantive changes, but it just sailed right through with no substitute, which is a very different story from most of the bills we worked on this session. All right, and then Senate Bill 262. This bill started with sort of duplicate language in the original version of House Bill 37 with the density overlay. And then there's also provision in there that required general plans to be adopted by ordinance. Our understanding is that this was trying to make general plans binding. There's still some discussion to be had about whether it actually did that. But either way, it was a concerning policy and was ultimately removed. The bill went through several changes. Where it ultimately ended up was some technical amendments to the HOPS, the Home Ownership Promotion Zone tool. It allows legislative bodies to settle litigation through consent decrees or consent agreements without the approval of a Board of Adjustments. That was a fairly significant policy change. Depending on how your planning commission is set up, you should look into this, and we'll have more conversations later. And then it also requires counties to comply with land use provisions for all pending and new applications, essentially meaning that new state law would have to be applied to pending land use applications or even approved land use applications. So this isn't a big change. There's no change for cities. It's not in Title 10, it's in Title 17. But we'll dive more into what this means in a future land use training. Lastly, the bill just creates a new shared equity sharing program to assist new home buyers. That's not municipal related, but I think it's a positive step in the housing space. And then I'm turning it over to Jared.
Thanks, Carson. This HB 368 was the land use task force bill. Where it started, there wasn't anything, and where it ended up, there's a lot there. As Justin said at the beginning, this is not a training, and so we won't go into each one of these, but these are the subjects that we were able to address. Probably one of the most notable here is the land use noticing, which will save quite a bit of money for cities in noticing for land use amendments, simple text amendments, and again, we'll go through quite of this in our future trainings. This one passed and is one that we supported. HB 360. This also was part of the housing bills. This came from the Commission on Housing Affordability, and where it began was just a simple provision extending the ability to have a closed meeting under the Open Meetings Act and to discuss development or financing of political subdivision owned land. Where it ended up was that it allowed first and second class cities to obtain loans from the Utah Housing Corporation up to $10 million and to purchase, renovate, and resell at a $450,000 affordable housing rate, which is, and then also have it be deed restricted for at least 5 years. It did also keep the Open and Public Meetings Act, closed meeting extension on that, and so that is that bill. SB 181 is all about garages and parking. It did have quite a few provisions in there about the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund, but that was removed instead. So it began with certain parking and garage and design standards. As you can see there, covered parking, uncovered. What tandem means is actually 2 spots, and then in the original bill, it prohibited cities from requiring garages or requiring anything additional to this in a development agreement. And it also limited the ability to regulate where the garage or parking went on the lot. There were quite a few substantive changes here, although not a lot of language changed. What language did change made a big difference here. This now only applies to MIHP cities. The parking space and size only applies to single family and 2-family and townhomes instead of everything else. The parking size for the uncovered increased. We were able to get it to 9 by 20 instead of 9 by 18. Those sizes cover, generally speaking, most of our city's sizes already in their code. So it shouldn't affect many. Uh, when you look at your code, so that was a positive change. The parking size uh, that would count for the covered and the tandem parking required that space be unobstructed. So, in other words, there couldn't be, a big jut out taking out some of that space and removing some of those feet of what should be a garage space for a vehicle. Um, and then we we limited the prohibition on requiring not being able to require garages to only those that are owner occupied and affordable housing units, which is 5-year deed restricted and sold at 80% of the average median income. And so the idea is that those that want cheaper homes, hopefully we can pass those savings of not being able to build the garage onto the next homeowner. Let's go on to the next slide. HB 58. This, although it says building inspector amendments, it's actually building officials, which is different than building inspectors. Where it started, building officials had to have certain qualifications, and we've talked about this before. Those qualifications are still the same, with the exception that it adds a plan examiner to the list of qualified trades. So if you have been if you have a plan examiner that has worked for 4 years, but none of those other trades, then that would count toward the 6 years. And so one other thing that we were able to negotiate with Representative Peterson is extending the effective date to January 1, 2026. It's not much longer, but it is a little bit longer to be able to get these qualifications available. And I'll pass it off.
Yeah, back to Carson.
All right, thank you, Jared. House Bill 37. This is the came out of the Political Subdivisions Interim Committee. This has been largely a response to the housing audit. It started off with an overlay for home ownership that didn't totally work, but was optional. It had additional reporting metrics through moderate income housing plans, which were onerous and not totally workable either, and then created a sort of vague requirement for creating regional plans. That's how it started. Justin, can you go to the next slide? Thankfully, it ended in a much better place. What it ended up doing is creating the Affordable Homeownership Moderate Income Housing Plan submenu. This is all optional, so there are no required changes here. But what it does is essentially acts as the bridge for the next phase of moderate income housing plans. If you choose specific strategies from this menu, they will count as 2 to 3 or as 3 items and grant compliance for the base year, the initial year, plus 2 subsequent years. So we think this is positive. Again, it's all optional, and we will do a much deeper dive on this because there are some potential wins for cities here if administered correctly. So we'll talk more about that later, but I wanted to put this on your radar. And then lastly, this does require the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget to develop a state housing plan, which they are already underway in. So this will sort of give them statutory guidance for that next phase. Senate Bill 179. Essentially, this bill, we talked a little bit about LPC both before and after the session. This will require local governments to adopt an ordinance governing how they will evaluate new and unlisted business uses. So it gives local governments pretty broad flexibility. Most local governments already have these policies informally. This will require you to put that in ordinance. The initial bill required the authorization or decision to be made within 60 days. So it could still be a no within 60 days. We pushed back on that provision, and the bill was changed to give local governments whatever time frame they want. So you have to have an ordinance, you have to set a time frame, but you can choose that as you see fit. And again, at the end of the day, you could still approve or deny it. It doesn't preempt local governments in any one direction. So again, we'll go through this more in future land use trainings. Senate Bill 23. This is an easy one. This essentially fixed the FIZ, the first or the I don't remember the acronym anymore. The first home investment zone. Essentially, this clarified the definition of developable area. This fixed the formula problem that we identified last year. So this essentially makes the FIZ workable, which we're really excited about. Does really make a lot of policy changes, and it passed. So we're excited to see that up and running. Senate Bill 26 became a little more complicated. This started as a straightforward cleanup to housing and transit reinvestment zone codes. It started by really just clarifying the definition of affordable housing to match some of these other economic development tools. Where it ended, again, this will be worthy of a much deeper dive, but it created a specialized convention center PID, which has some additional tools that other PIDs do not have. It is limited to a PID around a convention center in the capital city, so super specific. It's being done in conjunction with some of the other economic development down there. And then it creates a convention center reinvestment zone, which is, again, sort of like a specialized housing and transit reinvestment zone. We'll go into more detail here, but this really only affects Salt Lake City at this point. And then House Bill 88. This was a major concern for the league. This is a broad ADU preemption. In essence, we oppose this firmly. We worked the committee and the bill failed and did not move out of the political subdivisions committee. So these conversations will continue, but fortunately, due to league pushback, this bill did not move forward. House Bill 90, like HB 88, this bill was a pretty broad preemption. While that was for ADUs, this is for lot sizes, so essentially allowed 6,000 square foot lot sizes by right. Again, this violates multiple league principles. The league are activated, and we pushed back on committee, and we're able to hold this there. So fortunately, these two bills did not move forward, but we expect a lot more conversations on zoning and housing throughout the interim. That's no news to anybody, but do not expect a break because these bills failed. Senate Bill 152 likewise did not pass. This would have prohibited cities from requiring garages on 1 and 2 family dwellings. We talked to the sponsor and he held the bill because of Senate Bill 181. So we appreciate his willingness to talk with us, and this bill would have deviated a little bit from that and gone a little bit farther. So we're glad to have had 181 to bring up in proactive defense. All right, and then this is a final reminder. I know that some of you have been submitting feedback on the housing strategic plan. We'll put one more ask in the LPC recap and Friday Facts, but please take a look at this. The housing strategic plan will have huge ramifications for the next couple of years of housing policy conversations. The initial step, the part that's public right now, phase 1, just contains it identifies tactics. It talks about some different metrics and some high-level framework. Nothing super controversial in this, but this will set the stage for years of policy conversation. So pretty please take a look at this, send us feedback, check your emails because we'll send out that request again. And then I'll turn it over to Jared.
All right, thank you. SJR 4, this is what this did is it would take away the attorney-client privilege and attorney work product privilege from being in effect if the Office of Legislative Auditor General requested records from a city. We were able to oppose this and finally ended up removing the language that would take away that privilege. It eventually passed, so we were much more comfortable with the language that was in there, and we no longer had the same concerns. SB 154, again, we oppose this because it took away the same privileges that I just talked about with SJR 4. And we came to an agreement on some language that would provide some nuances when those when those requests would come in, and if a city said, no, these are privileged documents, that some sort of an arbitrator would look at it, and then we've identified the cost issues. Those documents would then be reviewed only by the arbitrator unless and until the arbitrator found that it was actually not privileged material. We also opposed this, and but it eventually passed. But even though we opposed it, even in the end, we got a long ways, a lot further than when it began. HB 215 also deals with the Office of Legislative Auditor General. This is where it started, was if a city intentionally hindered, delayed, falsified, or prevented a legislative audit by any of those methods, then it would be a Class A misdemeanor. If they did it by concealing an audit request or non-privileged information or providing false information, that would be a Class B misdemeanor. The only thing that changed between when it started and when it ended was warning any person of an impending legislative audit was no longer included within the Class B misdemeanor criminal penalty. Ultimately, we were neutral on this because we felt like it would be a difficult political uphill battle to fight something like this, but it eventually failed anyways. So that's where that one ended up. HB 364, this would provide government immunity to law firms or attorneys hired by a municipality to perform legal work related to governmental function. Where it began was that it defined a contract government legal, a contracted attorney doing legal work for the city as an employee. We were able to remove that language and get better language in there that did not have those same concerns. So in this regard, we supported this. It eventually died on the Senate second reading calendar and never came back up for a vote. So HB 77, this is the flag display amendments. And where it began is only certain flags were permitted to be flown, and if you do fly it, with a time to cure it and a violation per day if you didn't. And where it ended was it just added more flags to be on the permitted list, but no other substantive changes. We did oppose this based upon the unconstitutionality of taking this action with the flag display. But that fell on deaf ears and it passed. So that's where that one is. And I'll pass it back.
All right, Carson, on retirement.
Thanks, Justin. So retirement should be pretty straightforward. We had two bills that we were tracking in this category. First is Senate Bill 20. This would have allowed URS employers to pick up the additional member contributions that exceeded the employer cap, as long as there is parity for Tier 2 hybrid employees. We had members on both sides of this, so ULCT landed in a neutral position, but the bill never passed or received a Senate vote. There was some fiscal impact for the state, and this was not the year for state fiscal impacts. Similar story for House Bill 417. This bill would have essentially waived the cooling off period for public safety employees who become is targeted at the school guardian program. This bill was never heard in committee either and did not move forward. So we'll have more interim conversations on retirement, I'm sure. But when a tight fiscal year, neither of these stood a strong chance.
All right, and I'm going to hit a few bills here. So municipal broadband, we took this bill to LPC. It started out in the exact same place that it ended, subjecting municipal broadband services to certain places for voter approval. We tried to negotiate on this bill to get it into a better place, and ultimately the negotiations fell apart. The sub two is just the original bill. So the bill basically passed as was originally proposed, even though we were opposed to that bill. So that was passed. If you're a broadband city, we'll probably follow up on this bill later. Water bills. This is another bill that died in Senate Rules Committee, never went anywhere. It requires directors of community water systems to make sure there is a cybersecurity plan. This is one we expect to come back in the interim, but this died in the Senate Rules Committee. Nobody has to make a cyber security plan now unless you want to, but do expect this one to come back again. 274, this was the one that required consideration of water conservation rate when setting water rates. This is something that many cities already do. We asked for a few changes in this one to make it more palatable for us, and we got those changes in. The big thing that happened at the very end of the session is this new amendment showed up, a new substitute 5, that said that after July 1st, 2030, a secondary water provider has to charge the lowest rate to anyone who's using a portion of their water to grow food. So basically, if you have a little garden of fruit trees, you would be charged the lowest rate. Now, the bill passed, this language was added in, but the effective date on that portion is July 1st, 2030, with an understanding that we'll come back and figure this out in the next few interims to make sure this doesn't just gut all of tiered water rates and water conservation. The fluoride bill, it passed. We didn't have a position on this one because we had a split membership on it. So that one's easy. HB 285 talks about no later than July 1st, 2020, if you are, as a condition of receiving state or federal financing grants, you shall adopt a capital asset management plan. That's something that has to be updated every 5 years. Sub 1 made some good clarifying technical changes to this. This was a bill that we were monitoring. I think we may have been neutral on it at some point. We did get a few changes into it to make it a little bit better. But if you're going to have a capital asset management plan beginning in 2028, if you're looking for that state or federal financing through the water systems. SB 220, this is the stormwater bill. So where it started, this started last year, if you remember correctly. HB 507, that was a House bill last year. The sponsor changed bodies. But HB 507 is the current law. Under that law last year, we lost fine authority and only allowed electronic inspections without a lot of parameters. So this is a bill that we worked on throughout the interim to get into a better place. That's why we ended up on neutral on it. Many of the changes we requested made it in there, even though we were opposed to the bill last year. So Sub 1 made clarifying technical changes. It added in a fine schedule. It clarifies when stop work orders can be used, and it has better parameters around electronic inspections and clarifies some application timelines. So on this bill, we know this is not a bill that we were excited about, but the goal this year was to make last year's bill better. And I think we got to that place. All right, let's jump to the election bills. First off, the mayoral recall election bill. That bill never was presented anywhere. It died in rules. Thanks to everybody who reached out to their reps on this one. They got the word very quickly that we were not interested in this bill, and it never even got a committee hearing. So nothing happened on this bill, which was good news. Another bill that never went anywhere. This allowed a 5 council and a 5-member council form of government to retain employees, basically to assist the council, but not the mayor. That bill also never went anywhere. It was never presented. It died in rules. So that's one more bill that just never went anywhere. And thanks to everyone who reached out on that one as well. SB 300. This is the big voting bill. As you remember, this one started out with ballots being mailed to voters, but ballots being returned in person with voter ID. Using a Dropbox, you must also show ID, and Dropbox is only being available during certain hours. There are a whole host of other things, but that was kind of the big gist of the bill. Where it ended is beginning in 2028, there's different rules around voter identification, but basically you have to verify your voter identification and share the last 4 digits of the voter's primary voter identification number when signing the envelope for your ballot. And then a voter will have to re-up that they want to get their ballot by mail. So this was the bill, and it also does a whole host of other things. It's a big, huge bill. But this is the bill that we ultimately ended up neutral on with those changes. The pushback that you as members did and we as the league did helped get that bill moving forward to a better place. So thank you to everyone who helped us on that bill. With that, kick it over to Carson for short-term rentals.
Thanks, Justin. So this House Bill 256. There's a couple pieces here. First, the bill clarifies the so-called not well language. That is the provision about solely regulating or enforcing short-term rental ordinances based on a listing. So it doesn't change that underlying policy, but clarifies that language. Again, future training will go into more depth about what that means. The biggest policy change in this bill is that it addresses how municipalities can interact with short-term rental listing sites. Initially, it let municipalities require short-term rental listing sites remove listings that they'd identified as being unlawful. Around the second or third substitute, there was a provision in a draft that would have preempted local land use around short-term rentals. We worked with a work group through there's a LPC subgroup, and thank you for everybody who joined on that next day Zoom call. And then subsequent follow-up. And that group identified the number one priority is preserving local land use authority around short-term rentals. So the provision that would have preempted our land use authority never actually showed up in the bill. There was one of the substitutes has some of the highlighted provisions mentions that, but there was never actual language. So we consider that a win. Essentially what this now does is it would allows local government to submit a formal request that is non-legally binding for listing sites to remove unlawful short-term rentals. So there's no teeth behind it, but what it lets us do is collect data, and if we're consistently seeing listing sites not removing listings, then we'll be able to come back with a stronger argument in the future and try to have that better informed conversation. So while this ultimately doesn't change a lot for local governments in the short-term rental space, I think it's still a small victory in creating that process. And then it also gives us some more authority on using listing site advertisements for TRT enforcement. So again, not a huge policy change at the end of the day, but this is the first short-term rental bill to pass in 7 years since the not well language was imposed. So again, I think it's a step in the right direction and helps us move some momentum going forward. And I think I'm going to Molly next.
Excellent. So 329 is our first homelessness bill. This was by Representative Clancy. It was originally really targeted at governance and service providers, though it did have some implications largely for shelter cities. We were able to get a lot of the provisions that would have negatively impacted shelter cities out. A big thing for all of our cities, especially those with winter response plans to be aware of, is one, it created the task force, or it changed who can be on the task force, so there's more elected say on who is on that task force. And then it also changed the winter response plan, so it is a recommendation to the Utah Homeless Services Board. We're still trying to assess what exactly that will mean, but that is what the bill changed. If we can hop over to 505 by Representative Elison. This is a bill that largely came at city request. A lot of these provisions, including state campground provisions, requirements that Code Blue site selections be objective and data-driven, and streamlining some reporting. So we're pretty pleased with that bill. We supported it, it passed. And then SB 182 was the Code Red bill that we were negotiating throughout interim. We eventually got to consensus and we were neutral on this bill. However, that did not really matter because it ended up dying in flames on the House floor. And then finally, the homelessness revisions by Nelson Abbott. We discussed this earlier in the session. It sought to reduce mitigation contributions, but there were a lot of technical issues within the implementation as well as broader mitigation policy conversations. So we ended up opposing that this year. It died in committee and nothing happened with it. And then with that, we'll jump to public safety. HB 465 was one of the big bills we were watching this year. It started targeting, well, candidly, it started targeting Salt Lake City, but the drafting of it captured a lot of cities, including first-class cities with shelters, as well as first-class cities overall. It required agreements with DPS for kind of co-policing in some instances. And if cities did not enter into that agreement, they would have lost their mitigation and B&C road funds. It also created a rapid response team for every city of the first class. Where it ended is that it is only targeted at Salt Lake City. It requires an agreement between the city and DPS. However, it does not have the financial penalties. It no longer has rapid response teams, and it creates eminent domain authority for DFCM in the hopes of locating a potential shelter.
All right, I'm going to jump over to massage therapy amendments. This is the bill that we started tracking during interim. Basically, the goal of this was to make it harder for massage parlors to operate to operate for human trafficking or for sex work, and so this required additional licensing and additional registration for owners of massage establishments. Um, Basically, the big concern from our perspective, or the thing that we're tracking, I guess, from our perspective, was that if the Division of Professional Licensing is going to assess an administrative fine and take appropriate action against one of these establishments, they may send letters of concern to the municipality or the municipality's police department, and which case the law enforcement could get involved and go help deal with that situation. So this is a bill that we do not have time to talk about how weird it got in the middle. But it started out as a normal bill, kind of weird for a minute, and ended up as the bill that we were expecting to have passed there. This is one that we were monitoring on, but it did pass and could come into play in the future if you have these establishments in your community. Cannabis production amendments. This is one that we both supported and that it passed. This requires an individual who is in a cannabis production establishment to submit a proposed operating plan to reduce odor. Basically, the goal of this one is to do some studies and to work with these establishments to reduce the odor around some of these establishments. We know this has been a problem in some of your communities. And so they're going to work through this. They're going to do some studies on this and also work with the establishments to get to a better level of odor control around cannabis. SB 215, so this is the start of our suite of ambulance bills. Basically, they all started and ended about the place we expected them to. So SB 215 dealt with interfacility transport services, grants authority to municipalities and counties to ensure that a minimum level of ground ambulance interfacility transport services are provided within the municipality. So this is a bill that gives a little bit more control to municipalities. We supported this bill and it passed. 301, this one put a freeze on rates while an audit is conducted. So establishes the base rates in the bill in 301 and then puts a freeze on those while an audit is conducted to come back for additional discussions around what those rates should look like. So we're neutral on this one, and it did pass out. 391 gave the Bureau of Emergency Medical Services, or BEMS, some enforcement authority, clarified some fines set by the Trauma System and Emergency Medical Services Committee, and then created the Emergency Medical Services Critical Needs account. So we're neutral on this one, didn't have as many direct impacts on us, but it's one that we were watching and didn't get involved with a little bit. And then SB 209 also created the Emergency Medical Services Critical Needs account. They were coordinating on those bills. The sponsor, Darren Owens, of this bill was the floor sponsor of the previous bill, 391, and put some additional parameters and training rules, or excuse me, parameters and rules around training centers and around investigations for BEM. So all in all, the ambulance bills ended up in a good place this year. We know there was some concern and some rumors about some really bad ones coming out, but ultimately those were able to get pushed back on. A lot of props to the Chiefs for doing a lot of good work on this one, and we coordinated with them on that. Finally, HB 40, this is the school safety amendment. This one started off in the interim with a lot of concern given the county sheriff authority over local law enforcement to coordinate on school safety. It ended up with local law enforcement shall coordinate with the county, but it doesn't give the county sheriff that authority over them to demand resources or do things. So it basically puts us in a similar place to where we were at before. The bill does a whole lot of other things around school safety, deals with glass and key locks and all kinds of things. But this is the part that we were concerned with. Ultimately, 7 substitutes later, we ended up neutral on this bill, and it did pass out. With that, kick over to Jared for Grandma and Privacy.
Okay, so SB 277, this removed the SRC, the State Records Committee, and inserted an administrative law judge who the governor selects and to a 4-year term. Originally, they had removed the balancing test, but had by the end it was added back in, and also established a periodic review process every 2 years, starting in 2027, evaluated how good or bad the director was doing. We supported this, and it did pass. HB 444, data privacy amendments. This was cleaning up from last year's HB 491. Two things that I want to point out. Where it ended is it added one member to the Privacy Commission representing cities. That was a late add. And also it pushed the contractor contract requirements of putting in the contract that contractors would have to abide by the privacy rules of Utah, and pushed it out to 2026 so we could have more discussion during the interim. This ultimately passed and we supported it. SB 163, government records amendments. This is one that ultimately failed in rules and that was a monitor on our radar. It would require a one-page sheet created by the state and given to municipalities, and if the municipality adopted an ordinance that changed anything or made additional guidelines and requirements related to GRAMA, they would also have to do a one-pager as well and post it, but ultimately it failed.
All right, back to me to talk about gravel. All right, this one's going to be tricky. I spent hours talking about gravel, and I'm going to do it in about 60 seconds. So if you remember, this bill started out with a gravel operator being able to expand to any land that they owned or controlled. Challenging a vested use was through clear and convincing evidence, very high standard. And there was a notice to the city or town. You had to have a hearing within the next available meeting more than 10 days away. And you could only stop expansion if there was clear and convincing evidence of imminent endangerment of public health, safety, and welfare. So that's where we started out. Where we ended up was a much more nuanced and a much better defined place. So this bill did ultimately pass. We were opposed to the bill. We engaged on the bill through 4 different substitutes in the session, and it did ultimately pass. But even though we're opposed, it did end up in a better place. So now the gravel operator can expand only to contiguous land that has a common boundary and is not separated by a highway. It has to be owned or controlled before May 7th, 2025. So effectively, if you don't own or control the land now or can't get a hold of it in the next 2 months, there's going to be a freeze on that automatic expansion. You cannot have abandoned the operation for more than 24 months, and the operation has to produce commercial quantities of material. And there are some specific definitions around that in the bill. But you've got to be producing a lot of gravel. You can't just dig a hole and say, we haven't abandoned this. It's more specific. And then the part that is big for us is that once they do the notice to city or town of expansion, the council can make a finding of endangerment by a preponderance of the evidence. So we lowered that standard from clear and convincing to public health, safety, and welfare, took out the imminent. It's just to public health, safety, and welfare. And then the council can propose reasonable mitigation measures. If the operator agrees to comply with those mitigation measures, then we may not prohibit expansion. But that also implies that if they don't agree to those measures, that there could be a prohibition on expansion there. The big part is this applies not only to gravel, but also to mining. So if there's an expansion of mining, then that applies also. So again, we were opposed to this bill because of the preemption and the expansion, but ultimately ended up in a much better place. So I wouldn't say we're comfortable with it, but we were much happier than where we were when it began. So over to Carson for rev and tax.
Thank you, Justin. So we'll start with House Bill 379. This is not specifically a revenue or tax bill. What this really does is shifts the defaults for population formulas, for municipal population formulas to the Utah Population Center. That means that for state dollars that are run through a formula to local governments, they will be using this where there is no federal requirement to do so otherwise, and where data is available. We supported this bill because we think this will provide better data, which leads to better policy. One quick note is that it did add the requirement for the Utah Population Center to post annual sub-county population estimates. So we should have, this is an annual requirement, so we should have more data on municipal populations coming out every year, and I think that's a positive as well. Senate Bill 67, I believe, is next.
Yep.
So this bill would have allowed certain municipalities to impose the rural EMS tax. We were supportive of this. This is the second year now that the bill has failed in the final night on the reading calendar. This year it was probably another minute or two would have passed. It was the next bill up on Senate concurrence at 11:59. So really unfortunate. This would have helped a lot of those small communities who are shouldering a disproportionate burden of EMS services outside of their borders in southern Utah. And then HB 295, this bill would have allowed a city to put a lien on a customer's property for lack of or past due payment. Unfortunately, this bill just didn't get prioritized, and although it was whittled down a little bit, so it would have been really helpful to cities, it just didn't get prioritized and put on the calendar in time to be read and voted on in the Senate. And then House Bill 511, this bill would have sought to require a ballot approval for property tax increases, so created a different process than truth and taxation. We expressed our concerns to the sponsor, as did other groups like the Taxpayers Association, and the sponsor agreed to send this bill to interim to have a more thorough conversation around property taxes going forward. House Bill 456. This bill affects state TRT and gives counties more flexibility. This ultimately raises the rate. It's actually incorrect on this slide. It raised from 0.32 to 1.07%, and it changed the formulas. That's also tweaked a little bit on the last version of this bill, so we'll have the updated slide sent with everything else. But really, the biggest impact on municipalities, in addition to the more money for the tourism mitigation grants, is that a few high impact cities will get statutory seats on the county tourism advisory boards and help direct TRT distribution. And then
all right,
I think this is you.
Tough. We're going to take Tough really quick. We've had a lot of discussions around Tough. Representative Karen Peterson's bill, there was a substitute proposed that would have exempted religious organizations. That bill, that substitute did not pass. And then the bill in its original form that we had supported passed over the Senate. The Senate subbed the religious organization exemption back in, sent it back to the House. The House circled it on the board. Representative Peterson circled it on the board, and then it sat there and died on the board. So we end up in another year without a transportation utility fee bill, which is not a bad thing for us. It allows us to continue doing what we're doing. But this is one we don't expect to go away. So stay tuned for additional tough discussions throughout the interim. Oh, there we go. My slides didn't want to go for a second. Don't worry, we have like 3 minutes left. We're going to fly through these ones. County formation amendments. This one died in House rules, never went anywhere. Mowing ordinances. This was the golf course bill. The bill was amended a couple of times, but also died on the House board. So no changes to mowing ordinances. Economic development amendments. This ends the Unified Economic Opportunity Commission. The CHA, however, will continue. Make some changes around this one, but 9 subs later, the above still is the same. UEOC is gone, CHA is still around, and GOEO is responsible for some additional economic development strategy. And finally, 504, not finally, but 504 in this section, it requires candidates for municipal office to file a conflict of interest form when declaring candidacy. So those forms that the elected officials had to fill out back in January, February, have to be filled out when they declare candidacy. If you already filled one out earlier in the year, you do not have to fill it out again when you're declaring candidacy. And Molly, our nuclear expert.
Hello, all. This created the Utah Energy Council, which is able to designate energy development zones. These zones can only be created by the land use authority. So a municipality, a county, or a state land use authority like MIDA or Inland Port. Originally, the bill said that they could consult with local governments to see how they wanted the property tax distribution to work. Now it outlines that they must share that property tax with local government, and yep, we'll call it there.
All right, Jared, on billboards.
Yeah, so this one discussed what happens when a owner of a billboard needs to change locations based upon a highway expansion or a sound wall going up, I want to focus on where it ended up. This allowed the owner to move it to within the same city or unincorporated county on the same highway, on the same property, or on an adjacent property, or by agreement to a different place, a different city or a different county. So this is within the same city. The reimbursement, if the city refuses, would be just compensation, and there would be no limit except for city boundaries in relation to freeways, and on state highway, 1 mile, but it can't be beyond the city boundaries. So we were able to limit that to that city boundaries. Our position was neutral on it, and it eventually passed.
All right, and Carson, final bill.
All right, this is the final bill with 4 slides. So Senate Bill 195, initially, so this was the Transportation Omnibus Bill, another massive bill. There was one little provision in the underlying bill that created a lot of problems for cities, and I won't go into depth, but that was the canal provision that would have been preemptive and contained serious B&C penalties. Working with the sponsor and several stakeholders, we were able to negotiate this to a much better place. So now there's a new general plan element. So we switched to supporting the bill because the sponsor was willing to make those changes. And then the bill became much more complicated. I believe there were 7 substitutes total on this bill. So in the 4th substitute, after a couple of technical things, the bill added a moratorium on Salt Lake City doing any highway reduction strategies. And that was very concerning. So several weeks of negotiations and several more substitutes later, the bill now requires Salt Lake City to do a joint study with UDOT. Justin, could you go to the next slide? Go to sub 7, thank you. So all the other provisions are still in there. I just didn't want to list them all out. But it requires Salt Lake City to do a traffic study with UDOT to study mobility and environmental impact of traffic reduction. And then that will be reported back to the Transportation Interim Committee. And now Salt Lake City's basically there's restrictions limited to arterial roads and state highways, and basically just those that do not conform to that highway mobility plan. And then this provision's repealed in July of 2029. So I also want to recognize Salt Lake City for all of their work in negotiating this. Anytime that a city is singled out, it's problematic, but we were able to work with them and the bill sponsor and other transportation stakeholders to get this bill to a much better place. The last thing I will say on this bill is the only thing that changed more than these provisions is electric unicycles. I don't know what an electric unicycle is, but if you go back through these 7 substitutes, you'll see that provision goes in and out and must have been controversial somewhere. So I don't know the story there, but just a fun Easter egg for you.
All right, and with that, really, we didn't start covering bills until less than 60 minutes ago. So 64 bills in, I'm going to say a little under 60 minutes. But thanks everyone for sticking with us. Here's what's coming up. Got through March 13th, got through today's recap. Additional trainings on the 19th, 26th on land use, 9th, another spring training. So watch for more information about that. We will also begin working on our legislative wrap up where we dive a little bit more in depth into these bills. So if you have specific bills you want additional training on, if there's things you'd like us to cover, please let us know. But we will get that wrap up document out there. Also, just want to thank our entire legislative team. Jared, Carson, Molly, Megan, Alexa, and Cameron, who's flying home on a plane right now. Cassidy, everyone that worked with us. It was a team effort. And thank you to you as league members, to our extended family who work on all of this. It was a big session. There was a lot that happened, but none of us could have handled this alone. So again, reach out to us. Let us know what you need as far as training goes as we flip into that mode. But thanks to everyone who joined today, and thanks everyone for all the help during the session. See you later.